years ago, going to CSU as a student. And then when I went off to Bible college later in years, I wondered why it was that the Caesars were persecuting Christians and the Herods. Today I understand. Because true Christianity promotes righteousness, justice, and says God is just, God is king, all must submit to his rule and authority, for he is above all rule and authority. And as long as the churches want to play church within the four walls of their church building, they'll have no problem with a government or government agencies or bureaucrats who want to get out of their line and their position and begin to promote unrighteousness. But where the problem develops is when you are willing to step out and say, hold it, you can't do that. This is what God's law says. About, when was it? Last February or January? Last January or February, we were talking about some things in our house. Specifically, the Fort Smith trial on sedition that took place this year. Let me tell you why it was of interest to me. Because it had come back to me in the way of a report that my name was one of the names that kept coming before the grand jury that gave the indictments for this particular trial regarding sedition. That has a way of gaining your attention in a particular event. If you analyze it, Christ was being tried for sedition, saying that there was a king higher than Caesar. And so was Paul. And although we did not agree with the men that we heard were being tried with, had nothing in common with them as such, didn't know most of them. I did know the two Arkansas farmers that you're going to see in this video. I knew that they had one thing in common, and that was, even though some of them were in an area that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, they all wanted the righteousness of Christ. And they were standing up against unrighteousness, and also they were doing something else that is almost becoming a crime today. They were just standing up in defense of the white race. And lo and behold, that is becoming a crime today. And we found that they had these common denominators. I didn't know what I could do about it. My wife became very burdened, and this has happened before in our marriage. I can remember years ago when I had a very successful career with the federal government, was making good money. She became burdened that I should become a preacher. But I don't want to be a preacher. Don't bring it up to me anymore. I got good reason not to be. In fact, I didn't even want to go to church anymore. And so she didn't bring it up. She just began to pray about it. It's a very, very effective method. Because all of a sudden I was burdened. And I had to go out and become a preacher. Well, she decided not to bring it up to me anymore, but she prayed about this sedition trial. And she had to pray that if it was God's will, that I would be receptive to the idea of making a documentary on this trial. And so she brought it up to me one day, and, what can I do about it? This is the attitude that a lot of times we have when we see unrighteousness going on. Well, what do you think about making a video? I didn't know why, but it seemed like a terrific idea. I had no idea how you make a video. We didn't have the equipment for it. We'd never done it, but from that time on, everything just began to fall in place. We found out that Steve Ray, our right-hand man, Scriptures for America, is not only talented in many other areas, but he's a very, very talented cameraman, can run editing equipment, has went to school for it, has studied it, and he's wanted to do this before, hasn't he, in his life? We didn't have any idea that was the kind of man we had in our midst. Well, what are you going to do for equipment? Well, I figured we'd rent a camera. I figured that out when I priced the cameras. The cameras' prices were unbelievable. In the course of trying to find a camera to rent, we heard about a small corporation in Denver that had some video equipment. And so we just on a lark decided to investigate it. And we found equipment that was brand new, 1 year old, had been used only once. We checked out the purchase price and where it was purchased. And it was top of the line, and not only was it a camera, but it was editing equipment, it was mics, it was stands, it was a small mini studio that was not for rent, but for sale. They had paid well over $40,000 for it within the last 12 months, and they had a price tag on it. And next came a couple miracles. One, they accepted our offer of, less than half of that. And number two, a man sent us a very, very large tithe check. He had sold a valuable piece of real estate, and it all happened the same time. And lo and behold, we were in the video business. And Steve was like a kid in a candy store with all this equipment. I had no idea what it was all about. Then comes the trip, the expense of going down there. We sent a crew down to begin to report on this. We had no idea how the trial was going to turn out, had no idea what we were going to find. And my wife took on the entire project because there was no way I could, and she was the one that had the burden. And she's done a remarkable job. I found out that in the video industry, in making documentaries, normally you have, first of all, a large sum of money for a requirement. That's why you have grants from such liberal sources as the Rockefeller Foundation, this type of thing. Secondly, you have at least a year to 2 years. And Sherry and Steve did this video documentary in 9 months with what seemed like a lot of money to us, but was just a drop in the bucket compared to the industry. And they did all of this while they took care of all their other activities. And not only that, I don't have time to go into it, but it became very dangerous down there. We found out that the media boys do not like other people coming onto their turf. And we write about this in our newsletter and how this particular documentary is going to be put out. Sherry, are there some things you want to say before we... That I'm missing? Yes, you're the second group to see this. Some of the men that are in prison are the ones that saw it first. We showed it to them to get their feelings on it. And again, the question, why would a church be involved with something like this? The reason the communists are scared of true Christianity is because when there is a revival, people rise up and they oppose injustice, and they say, enough is enough, you are not God. Even though you'd like to set yourself up, the state is God. And so we were just burdened to make this. We don't know where it's going to go, what's going to happen with it. I got a quote here from Solzhenitsyn in his book, Gulag. How many have heard that book, Gulag, Solzhenitsyn? He said, universal innocence also gave rise to the universal failure to act. Maybe they won't take you. Maybe it will be all blown over. The majority sit quietly and dare to hope. Since you aren't guilty, then how can they arrest you? It's a mistake. They're already dragging you along by the collar, and you keep on exclaiming to yourself, it's a mistake. They're setting things straight. They'll set things straight and let me out. Others are being arrested en masse, and that's a bothersome fact. But in those other cases, there is always some dark area. Maybe he was guilty. But as for you, you are obviously innocent. You still believe that the organs are humanly logical institutions, that they will set things straight and let you out. Why then should you run? And how can you resist right then? After all, you'll only make your situation worse. You'll make it more difficult for them to sort out the mistake. And it isn't just that. You don't put up any resistance. You even walk down the stairs on tiptoes as you're ordered to do so your neighbors won't hear. At what exact point, then, should one resist? When one's belt is taken away? When one is ordered to face into a corner? When one crosses the threshold of one's home? This video documentary is our small measure of resistance. As I said, in comparison to the industry, they have all the camera and the equipment, and they have the major networks. They have everything. This, in comparison, is a small, little, tiny pebble. But the enemy has long since learned, since the times of David and Goliath, how effective a pebble can be when it's put in the sling of the remnant. So we made this video documentary to put it in the sling of the remnant, and we'll see what happens to it. It's called Sedition Ussa. I think you'll find that Sherry and Steve did a superb job. I had nothing to do with it. It's their work, and I commend my wife for doing it.
It's so refreshing to look into these bright faces. Their purity of heart and mind refreshes me after spending so many months with my mind in the stench of the government's activities. The time spent in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and the research I've done the past few months have enlightened me even more as to why I feel distressed with the direction of my country and of my people. February 16, 1988, Fort Smith, Arkansas became the scene for the third major attempt of the United States government to prosecute men for the charges of seditious conspiracy. 10 men stood trial for seditious conspiracy, and 4 men stood trial for conspiracy to murder federal officials. The first time in the history of our country for anyone to be charged with conspiracy to murder without anyone being harmed. Believing I had come to see history in the making and justice to be served in the Western District of Arkansas, I was unaware I would be undergoing such a re-educating experience. I found one of the many peculiar things surrounding the sedition trial was the fact our government was trying 14 men on 4 different counts at one time.
Well, it is a very complex case simply because there are so many defendants. There are 14 defendants, and they're not all charged under the same conspiracy. Only 10 are charged with seditious conspiracy. Another section of the indictment includes a conspiracy to assassinate a federal judge. And yet another part of the conspiracy involves, interstate, transportation of stolen money. So you've got really 3 trials here involving 14 men, and that's what makes it so complicated to a layman, to an attorney, or to the jury, is how to separate all this when all the evidence is in, so that each man can essentially get that separate trial within the trial that he's entitled to.
Why would our government try these 14 men at the same time?
If they can show that all of these people fit in somehow, then it's just, they make the case that it's logical that they all be tried together for the same act, even though theoretically they're all being tried separately. It's convenient. It will make it easier for them to get a conviction.
I think it's not for judicial economy, but I think it's to increase their chances for a conviction.
Why does it increase their chances?
They're going to paint all the defendants with the same brush.
The 4 defendants involved in count 4 of the indictment, conspiracy to murder, tried for months to sever their trial from the 10 charged with seditious conspiracy, with no success. Why are you 2 being tried with these other 12?
We really don't understand. It was our opinion that this should have been severed, counts 1 and count 4 severed, because we do not feel that we belong in a seditious conspiracy and have put in motions and so forth challenging this, but the court did not see fit to honor those motions for severance.
I had to wonder, if our government was wanting an honest and fair trial for these men, why not try each defendant separately? Would justice not be served more favorably by allowing each one their own trial?
Very definitely, very definitely. Some of them could be tried jointly. I don't argue that proposition, but I think it'd be better off for everyone if there were separate trials in a lot of these areas.
The actual sedition indictment read as follows. From on or about July 1983 and continuously thereafter, up to and including April 1985, in the Western District of Arkansas and elsewhere, a group of persons willfully and knowingly combined, conspired, confederated, and agreed together with each other to overthrow, put down, and to destroy by force the government of the United States and form a new Aryan nation. The 14 men on trial were as follows. Robert Edward Miles, pastor of the Mountain Church of Jesus Christ in Cohocotah, Michigan. Richard Gert Butler, pastor of Aryan Nations Church, Hayden Lake, Idaho. Louis Ray Beam, Jr., computer salesman and bulletin board operator. Bruce Carroll Pierce, a member of the Notorious Order, presently serving over 250 years in a federal penitentiary. Richard Joseph Scutari, also a member of the Order, presently serving 60 years in a federal penitentiary. Andrew Virgil Barnhill, Order member, presently serving 40 years in a federal penitentiary. Artie McBrady, alleged Order member, presently serving 40 years in a federal penitentiary. David Eden Lane, Order member, presently serving over 150 years in a federal penitentiary. Richard Wayne Snell, presently on death row in an Arkansas federal penitentiary for the murder of an Arkansas state trooper and a pawn shop owner. Lambert Miller, on trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, for conspiracy to murder federal officials. Robert Neal Smalley, again, on trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, for conspiracy to murder federal officials. David Michael McGuire, youngest of all defendants, standing trial in Fort Smith for conspiracy to murder federal officials. William Wade, Ivan Wade, father and son, Arkansas farmers, presently filed a lawsuit against the FBI for what they called a cover-up in the murder of Arkansas Sheriff Gene Matthews and tax protester Gordon Call. The sedition law is of immense importance and goes far beyond the arresting and trying of individuals for, perhaps, some otherwise illegal act. According to Bouvier's Law Dictionary, sedition may be defined as a revolt against legitimate authority, the raising of commotions and disturbances in the state, or the advocacy or suggestion by word, act, or writing of public disorder or resistance to the government. Again, Bouvier's Law Dictionary defines conspiracy: a combination of 2 or more persons by some concerted action to accomplish some criminal or unlawful purpose, not in itself criminal or unlawful means.
And thus a seditious conspiracy is a conspiracy that with the thought of undermining something, a government, an institution.
Does there have to be physical violence involved for it to be sedition?
As far as a legal opinion, our law is the seditious conspiracy statute is if the intent of that seditious conspiracy is to undermine, oppose, put down, or overthrow the United States government by force. And that seditious conspiracy has to manifest itself in some overt act that furthers that conspiracy.
The whole theory of sedition is that a government has a right to protect itself. That sounds logical at first glance, but if you stop and think about it, theoretically, we're supposed to be the government.
I had to wonder if after verbally criticizing the actions of our government over a cup of coffee, could one be considered a seditious conspirator? If we consider the very document that declared this nation free from the tyranny of England, the Declaration of Independence would have to be considered the most seditious of all, and those men who signed it to be considered seditious conspirators. We as American citizens are actually commanded in this document that if we see our government usurping its authority, it's our right, nay our duty, to overthrow such a government. Immediately following the founding of this nation, our forefathers were concerned with our people being oppressed by a power-hungry government, but unfortunately to no avail. For within the United States, sedition laws were placed on the books at an early date, and for almost 200 years, concerned American citizens have worked at having this law rescinded. In 1797, John Adams was elected president by a majority of only 3 votes, after a hard-fought battle with Thomas Jefferson, who became vice president. Adams was a Federalist. Jefferson was a Republican. They disagreed violently on policies and became bitter enemies. In this turmoil, Jefferson defeated Adams in 1801. During the interim, in 1798, the Federalists enacted a sedition law on the pretext of controlling pro-French sentiment in the United States, but actually used it to harass, persecute, and imprison political opponents who had helped Jefferson in the previous election. They accused their victims of supporting France. A group of writers, speakers, and editors, all favorable to Jefferson, were sent to prison. The first victim of the Sedition Act was Matthew Lyon, a member of Congress from Vermont. He operated a newspaper. Writing editorially, he accused Adams of manifesting a continual grasp for power, an unbound thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. After the initial flurry of arresting and imprisoning individuals for opposing the federal government, the states of Kentucky and Virginia passed a remarkable series of resolutions severely denouncing the sedition law as unconstitutional. It is readily seen that the international banking cartel and those striving for total world control were represented in the argument. The Federalists were closely tied to the plutocratic government of England, with its Bank of England, founded in 1694, plutocratic being the government ruled by the wealthy. Because the people of America stood up against the power of a one-world plutocratic government, the whole idea of trying someone for sedition in the United States was forgotten. The demands of the First Amendment rights prevailed, and Americans were able to live with freedom and liberty for at least a few decades. In the early part of the 1940s, you were on trial by the United States government for sedition. Would you just briefly tell us about the circumstances leading up to that trial?
Very good. I was a member of the America First Committee. I was a ghostwriter for quite a number of speeches delivered by members of the America First Committee, Congressman Colonel Lindbergh, General Wood, Father Coughlin. I helped out with speech writing, and I was vitally interested in keeping the United States out of World War II, and thereby incurred the wrath of President Roosevelt.
But they had to try it again during World War II, when we see our government use sedition against pamphleteers. The same people, those same advocates of strong central government, were again the perpetrators. The same one-worlders were pushing the government to try individuals on sedition charges, just like in the days of Jefferson. Why were they so opposed to your literature?
Because it attacked the administration, because it criticized Roosevelt for dragging the United States into a war that 85% of the people had indicated they were against. And because many of us, not all of us, but many of us, had been in the habit of exposing what I term the synagogue of Satan.
In the World War II sedition trial, the power behind the government forced the indictment of those men and women who opposed the United States entering the war against Germany.
Many argue we're using it as a way of shutting down and eliminating from the public scene the America Firsters, the Bundists, and all the people that had opposed the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration and its prosecution of the war.
Lenin, who was a spokesman for the Zionist communist cause, stated that the road to total world control was through Germany, and therefore Germany had to be destroyed. I found it interesting that during this period of time, the enemies of the government were marked with such titles as Nazis and fascists, while during the trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1988, the pet names for such enemies were white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and racists. Are you a neo-Nazi?
You know, when they first started calling us that in the media, I had to ask somebody what it meant. I had no idea what it meant.
Do you know what it means now?
It means new Nazi, a new member of the German Workers' Party that ceased to exist in 1945, I guess. I have today taken it to mean that anybody who believes in the identity of faith is now classified as a neo-Nazi, and if that's what it is, if being a neo-Nazi is believing in the identity of faith, then yes, I'm a neo-Nazi. But am I a Hollywood stereotype Nazi? No, ma'am. No way, shape, or form.
I was already captured before I even understood what the terminology neo-Nazi meant. I didn't even know what it meant when I read it in the newspaper until someone explained it to me.
Where do you think
so no, it's not true.
Where do you think the term came from?
I think it's a media catchword, one to elicit emotion, to put a title on us that everyone can identify with by using new Nazi. They identify with the old Nazis. And so this is just one to elicit anger and hatred and so forth.
President Roosevelt and the New Deal administration, operating through the Department of Justice, caused 28 American men and women residing in different parts of this country to be indicted, arrested, and taken from their homes to Washington, D.C. for trial in a foreign jurisdiction. Entrapment schemes were used in setting the stage at the nation's capital. This was accomplished by having Dillard Stokes, a reporter on the Washington Post, address letters to the victims under the alias of Jefferson Bream and Quigley Adams, in which he ordered copies of their books, pamphlets, newspapers, and magazines mailed into the District of Columbia. Those victims, marked for destruction, found themselves in a hostile atmosphere where no one could expect to locate jurors who were not in some way, directly or indirectly, obligated to the federal government.
The government prosecutor later turned out to be a member of the Communist Party and one of Joseph Stalin's 5 best friends. His name was O. John Ruggie. He was a lawyer later on too for the Rosenbergs, and they were tried for delivering our atomic secrets to the Soviet Union.
The trial lasted for over 4 years, with Judge Eicher presiding over the case. Just before the case was thrown out of court, Judge Eicher died in his sleep, and another observing judge, Honorable Chief Justice Bolivia J. Laws, declared it to be a travesty upon justice.
The judge said, that is a travesty upon justice. He said every one of the defendants are victims of a travesty upon justice. He said the case is dismissed against all of them. Case is dismissed. That's the way I wound up. But it had ruined most of us financially. So the government can afford to try you whether they have any evidence or not. They can ruin you financially and use you to frighten anyone else that might be tempted to resist them.
Among the defendants were several members of the Nazi German-American Bunds. Just as the order members during the Fort Smith trial, these men in general had already been convicted of other crimes and were serving many years in prison already.
They really did some hanky-panky with respect to grouping together men like, say, from the German-American Bund during World War II, who had already been convicted of other crimes and put into prison. And they then lumped together with them Christian ministers such as Gerald Winrod, Elizabeth Dilling, who was a marvelous Christian lady who wrote the book The Plot Against Christianity, and in all probability that was the reason she was there as a defendant in the trial.
A few of the charges that the government made in the 24-point indictment include the following statements that the defendants were reported to have said or written.
The government of the United States, the Congress and public officials are controlled by communists, international Jews, and plutocrats. The present war is a dishonest war waged at the expense and measured in the blood and dollars of the people of the United States solely for the benefit of and to ensure the continuance of world domination by international bankers, international capitalists, Mongolian Jews, communists, and international Jewry. An honorable and just peace could be brought about speedily were it not for the opposition of the communists, international Jewry, and war profiteers.
Now, these proceedings did not pass without public and legislative protest. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio gave a lengthy castigation of the government's attempt to convict these men and women. Committees were organized and operated on a national scale, which were made up of pastors and laymen opposing these convictions. They realized that the government wanted to browbeat into silence every man and woman of God who might dare to lift a voice against strong central government and communism. There were even riots in the Rocky Mountain area over this trial. Senator Taft was quoted as saying,
I am deeply alarmed by the growing tendency to smear loyal citizens who are critical of the national administration and the conduct of the war. Something very close to fanaticism exists in certain circles here. I cannot understand it, I cannot grasp it, but I am sure of this. Freedom of speech itself is at stake unless the general methods pursued by the Department of Justice are changed. What would you say if, out of a clear sky, someone asked you if the sons of the American Revolution were disloyal? If the descendants of the sons of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the General Society of the Mayflower descendants and the ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic had permitted themselves to be used to corrupt the American Army? Absurd, ridiculous, impossible, of course. Absurd, yes. Yet that is precisely the charge which the Department of Justice has brought against those societies by indirection and inference in an indictment on file in the District of Columbia.
Congressman John T. Rankin inserted the entire indictment into the congressional record and made this statement to the House.
Mr. Speaker, I hesitate to use the word Jew in any speech in this House, for whenever I do, a little group of communist Jews howl to the high heaven. They seem to think that it's all right for them to abuse Gentiles and to stir up race troubles, but when you refer to one of them, they cry anti-Semitism or accuse you of being pro-Nazi. Read this indictment and then read it again and ask yourself if the white Gentiles of this country have no rights left that the Department of Justice is bound to respect.
I found it extremely interesting that while our government kept these 28 men and women on trial for 4 years, the war lasted for that length of time. Could it have been planned to keep these patriotic American writers, speech givers, and pamphleteers quiet until the war was completed? And now again, after 200 years and 2 tries, our government attempted for the 3rd time in history to prosecute Americans for seditious conspiracy. The United States government claims some of the overt actions of the alleged conspiracy took place in the Western District of Arkansas, but most of the alleged actions of the alleged conspiracy took place far from Arkansas. I came to Fort Smith to report on the proceedings of this trial. I realized before coming the historical significance surrounding the trial, but never surmised the many underhanded tactics used by our government in order for them to shut up men and women whom they feel are in opposition to them. On the first day of the trial, February 16, 1988, 130 potential jurors were brought into courtroom 310. Out of these 130 potential jurors, 18 jurors would be chosen to sit in possibly one of the longest trials in the history of this nation. I was amazed that within 8 hours, the 18 jurors were chosen. Is selecting a jury in one day for such a complicated case unusual?
For this case, I think it's appalling. Now, the judge, I will say this, the judge was trying to be fair. I think in his mind, he thought he was being fair. And in his mind, he thought this is the best way to pick a jury and not to pre-prejudice them with a lot of other questions. But my own personal feeling, I was appalled at how quickly it was done and the fact that we had no opportunity to get to know this jury at all.
Not only would these 18 men and women decide the fate of 14 men, but their decision would make a difference, possibly forever, in the lives of every American who loves and cherishes their freedom of speech and freedom to worship as they choose. I doubted anyone's ability to keep facts straight for over 2 months of very controversial testimony.
I don't think it's possible for humankind to keep all of this thing straightened out as to each defendant.
I was not only disappointed, but also astounded to learn that many of the witnesses our government was using against the 14 defendants had very little credibility in the eyes of the public. Would our government rationalize lying, cheating, or whatever in order to obtain a guilty verdict on these men?
Well, in their own minds, they rationalized this.
They rationalize lying,
well,
cheating,
certainly.
and buying
well,
people
if
off?
you know, and of course, you know, this is very early in the trial, and it would be improper for me to comment and say outright that all the government's witnesses are going to lie. Even if you take that argument, let's just assume for a minute they are lying. They have rationalized from a very mainstream American point of view that these men are dangerous and these men need to be put away.
This is one of the things that just does not really make any sense to us, that our government, that it belongs to us, would resort to these type things.
I expressed my contempt to the judge about the government using witnesses who lie. Mm-hmm. And the judge agreed with me. He said, but Mr. Pierce, this is an issue for the jury to decide.
James Ellison, who called himself the King of the Ozarks and claimed another man spiritually dead so he could have the man's wife, was the state's key witness against most of the defendants. Ellison claimed Richard Butler, along with several others, entered into a conspiracy with him at Pastor Butler's Aryan Nations Congress held in Hayden Lake, Idaho, at their Mountainous Family Campground in 1983. Ellison claims he passed around a piece of paper where each man present signed it, and then Ellison stated they had just committed treason against the United States of America.
Well, I think the piece of paper was passed around and everybody signed it, put their name and address on it, but I believe it was the sheer mailing list.
Of James Ellison?
No, James Ellison had a publication he sent out.
Right.
Okay, and these other people put out publications, so they wanted to swap publications back and forth. That's all I believe it was for.
Although this piece of paper was never presented as evidence in court, this one man's testimony, according to the government, outweighed all the other men's in the alleged conspiracy that night. According to the government, by these men's silence at Ellison's comment, they were guilty of sedition. How can you conspire to overthrow the government with someone you have barely met?
Ellison, I've seen him twice. This is the third time I've seen him today.
He was not a friend as such.
Oh, no.
In 1983, Gordon Call and Sheriff Gene Matthews were allegedly murdered by the FBI in a house owned by Bill Wade of Smithville, Arkansas. After much investigation into these murders, Mr. Wade and his son Ray formed a citizens committee to beseech the courts for a federal grand jury investigation into these murders. They also had filed lawsuits against the FBI and other government agencies. Again, the key witness who testified against not only Bill and Ray Wade, but also David McGuire, son-in-law of James Ellison, and Lambert Miller, was the King of the Ozarks himself, James Ellison.
In fact,
all the witnesses against us have criminal records, extreme criminal records, and there's no evidence that we did anything, and it's just a testimony of convicted felons. That's all it is. And we both flatly denied having any knowledge or participation or even talking to those people during that period of time. And we say it's a complete invention and fabrication, total.
Mr. Ellison testified that Bill and Ray Wade met with him in an old abandoned feed mill and offered money to Ellison and any one of his followers who would murder Federal Judge Waters and FBI agent Jack Knox. In the prosecution's closing arguments, Mr. Snyder argued that Ray and Bill Wade had an absolute obsession with these murders and would do anything they could to get even. As I became better acquainted with these two men, who, by the way, are being labeled as white supremacists by the media, when in fact they are Choctaw Indians, I did not see obsession, but rather a burning desire to see justice done in these unsolved murders.
I've said open publicly on television that I knew no other reason that I could be targeted for government prosecution other than that I had become a thorn in their side and a voice crying out for justice in that particular instance. I'd asked for grand juries. I'd gone on television, radios, things like this, speaking out against the events that happened on June the 3rd, 1983. And of course, as such, why we're still trying to find avenues and means to have this investigated and of course to get some justice put to the issue.
James Ellison is presently incarcerated by our government for charges of possession of illegal firearms. By his own testimony, he has not only received witness immunity, but his 2 wives and 12 children are presently being cared for with American taxpayers' money and are also under government protection. Allegations have been made that Mr. Ellison is receiving a shortened sentence because of his cooperation in this trial. And if our government had succeeded in obtaining a guilty conviction on these men, he would have been released from prison. And much of the testimony against many of the defendants was produced by Robert Matthews, a dead man. Many witnesses claimed Robert Matthews admitted to certain crimes and implicated many of the Fort Smith defendants in his statements.
A dead man did the testifying so much that it's unbelievable. You know,
Give me some examples.
Under common law, a dead man's not allowed to testify.
Right. After sitting through several weeks of this trial, I had to ask myself, why is the government so persistent on getting a guilty verdict on these men? Why were they willing to spend well over $8 million of our taxpayers' money, paying out $6,000 a day for the court-appointed attorneys alone, and have spent 3 years of much tedious research? What potential danger do these men and their ideas pose to the security of this present form of government?
I don't believe that we should have a de facto government. There's a great difference between a de jure government and a de facto government. I've written about that, and that's one of the reasons I'm probably in court, as I put out newsletters on the de facto government of the United States. And while I can't refute anything I've said, because I have all the facts, they can bring me into court or charge me.
Not only do I have enmity, I hate this government because it sets itself up in a position that's God's position to make and regulate laws, many of which are contrary to what is best for my people, my race, Israel. How can I feel otherwise?
They're all dedicated men with individual beliefs, individual concepts, who have been willing to lay it all on the line for their own race and their own God as they see them.
Why would they want to send someone such as yourself, who the only major crime was to be behind the wheel in a vehicle in an armed car robbery, and give you 6 times greater sentencing than anyone else? What is it they don't like about Richard Scutari?
My beliefs and the fact that I won't bow down to him. My knee only bends to my God. It won't bend to these people. I don't care what they do to me.
And you think they realize this?
Oh, they know it.
I have shown during the proceedings of the trial there were many questionable facets surrounding the government's involvement. These questions were not only being asked in my own mind, but also in the minds of many of the defense attorneys and visiting public.
After handling this case, what do you think of the integrity of the government?
I think like most of the other attorneys in the case, I'm quite concerned with a lot of the testimony that I saw. I think a lot of the testimony was false that was presented by the government, and I also believe or think that the attorneys or the government's witnesses were were not credible at all. People like James Ellison, his story has changed so many times in the last few years, and that I just can't see him being credible at all.
How do you feel about the integrity of the government?
My ideas about the FBI have changed pretty seriously.
Would you like to elaborate on that at all?
I've been very disappointed in what I've seen. That's about all I'll say on that fact.
When we tried to get interviews with the government's prosecutors concerning the many discrepancies surrounding this trial, they refused to talk with us. Those who were familiar with this trial believed that what was on trial was our First Amendment right, the right of free speech. Many others were saying that not only was our right of free speech on trial, but our freedom of religion was also on trial.
I believe the First Amendment is on trial, Ted. It's the right of the people to speak. That's what's on trial here.
I think basically the right-wing movement's on trial in this case, and it's just my own personal opinion that I think that the government has decided that these guys are getting too outspoken, and it's time to shut them down and to destroy the movement, and that's basically my opinion on it.
Even though our federal government had over 110 witnesses for the state, some being directly involved with some of the 14 defendants, over 1,200 pieces of visual evidences, and actual proceedings lasting well over 8 weeks, the jury of 10 men and 2 women found these 14 defendants innocent on all charges.
Praise Yahweh for this miracle.
I don't have any regrets with any of the prosecution of it, by any of the lawyers or anything that we did. It's just that we thought that we had presented the case in the best way that we could have.
Throughout the United States, there are over 150 other political prisoners being held by the federal government.
The matter was investigated by the FBI for some period of time. It was presented to us. We then presented it to several grand juries over an extended period of time. We thought that, and the grand jury returned an indictment. We thought we had a good case.
The United States of America, once the greatest nation on earth, is being accused by many patriotic men and women across the land of allowing a despotic, tyrannical government to take over the governing system formed and set up by our founding fathers. And within this despotic government, they believe the ruling force has lost its sense of integrity and honor.
I think the most important thing that can come out of this trial is for the American public to understand that the government does not, and for a long time has not, worn a white hat.
What we have in this particular age is a government based on corruption. It's corrupt in the highest places. It's based its policies on hypocrisy. It's betrayed its own people. It's not trusted by its own allies. It's the epitome of everything that is evil in government.
I found myself appalled at what our government had done in the lives of some of these defendants.
In October 9th, 1986, the FBI came to Memphis Federal Correction Institution, where I was originally housed. And they came and talked to me and ran down all their theory on this conspiracy and everything, and wanted me to cooperate and testify at a trial. And I told them I could not help them. And they said, well, go sleep on it, and we'll be back tomorrow and talk to you. Well, during this conversation, they laid down basically what come out in Fort Smith here. But when I come back the next day, they told me that they were going to see that Zilla served time. My brother would get another 20 years if I didn't cooperate. And then I told them then that you would not believe what I don't know. And I forget whether it was Jack Knox or Norm Stevens. One of the two says to me, Well, that's all right. We'll supply you with names, dates, facts, and figures. I just looked at him and I smiled and I says, I can't lie for you people.
The first thing is I brought out in my cross-examination of Zilla Craig, did the government threaten to put you in jail and your children in foster homes if you did not cooperate? Yes. I asked Richard Scutari's wife, Michelle Scutari, the very same question. The answer was yes. I asked my wife that, my ex-wife, mind you, and she answered yes. I think any government that goes to such low and underhanded methods is criminal in itself. To attack women and children, to threaten them.
After my many weeks of research, I had to ask myself the question, is there a power behind our American government? Are there really unseen forces behind the scenes?
Of course. Most definitely.
Okay, what?
I believe the ADL is pushing them into getting all these quote hate groups off the streets. Operation Clean Sweep, that's been quoted in the ADL's vocabulary for quite some time now.
Many of those I interviewed are accusing the Zionist movement in America, Attorney General Meese, the Anti-Defamation League, and its alleged hatred towards right-wingers, Christians, and especially what some call the identity movement, for being responsible for what they call Operation Clean Sweep.
I do believe that the government's intent was to shut down the right-wing movement. That was Attorney General Meese's opinion. We have got some ADL literature that claims credit for Operation Clean Sweep, that they basically put pressure on the Justice Department, said, hey buddies, we're calling in the favors, it's time to shut these folks down.
Are you familiar with Operation Clean Sweep with the ADLs?
Well, that's what this is all about, isn't it?
What's that?
The government trying to get rid of all these people, not only in this trial, but in subsequent trials to come.
So you are familiar with Operation
Yes.
Clean Sweep. Do you believe then that could possibly be behind this trial?
Oh, yes, very definitely, sure.
The ADL influencing
the grand
the
jury's
government?
met in my own state of Idaho in the last couple of weeks and taken testimony for additional indictments.
I think the government's broom reminds me of a used vacuum cleaner that hasn't been repaired in years. And as they sweep the floor of all the dissenters, they're going to find the dust that they stirred up will in time bury them.
Do you believe the Jews are behind our American government?
Not the Jews, the Zionist faction of the Jews.
In court, you testified that you coined the term Zog. Could you explain what that is or what Zog stands for?
Well, that went way back to a movement we had about 1970, which was called the Unity Now movement, which was a Canadian and an American movement to oppose one world form of government. We saw Zionism as the basic manifestation of a worldwide government. And we felt that they were a force that dominated the thinking in Washington. Zionism was a term that we applied to the occupational government of Washington, D.C.
Zionism, the people are finally realizing who's behind all the dirty work that's practically ever occurred in the United States. They're finally, through men like Peters and the sedition defendants, people are being educated. And it is vitally important to the Zionists to put the educators out of business.
One of the many Christian identity pastors listed on the Anti-Defamation League's hate report is Pastor Pete Peters, minister of a Church of Christ located in the Denver, Colorado area. Pastor Peters also has a national outreach ministry teaching the kingdom identity message. I asked Pastor Peters to explain to me why the Jewish Anti-Defamation League considers his Christian identity beliefs to be a theology of hate.
The identity movement today is a movement that is crossing denominational lines, wherein people are discovering a truth. That is, that the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Scandinavian, and kindred people are the Israel people of Scripture. There's simply been a case of mistaken identity, and it is not these people called Jews today. Now, to say something like that will cause you to receive from the ADL cries of bigotry, racism, etc. White supremacist is something they'll label you with. However, when they themselves claim to be the people of the Scriptures, the chosen people as they call themselves, no one ever calls them Jewish supremacists. Identity is, and from my experience in Fort Smith, is something, it's an idea that's been growing by leaps and bounds, and it is passing, it's an organic movement. You can't stop it. It doesn't have a clubhouse, it does not have dues, it's an idea, and you cannot kill an idea.
In the sedition trial of the 40s, as in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1988, evidence showed that communist, Zionist leaders, newspapers, magazines, and leftist radio commentators organized and conducted the most colossal smear campaign in our nation's history, designed to help convict the defendants in the public mind.
I think to understand why the media would want to do that is to, first you must identify who owns and controls the media and for what purpose. But without question, the Jews own and control all the major media. Now, there might be some cases that they do not own a specific newspaper here and there, but they control then the advertising of that paper, which is the main revenue. And with that in mind, they use the media to accomplish their particular goals and purposes.
The Jews do.
The Jews do, without question.
The United States government and our national news media are not only making allegations against the men who have stood trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, but also against anyone with right-wing tendencies and or Christian identity beliefs.
You can legally hate Nazis, you can legally hate Ku Klux Klansmen, you can legally hate all of these groups and get away with it. You can murder them, you can libel and slander them, you can throw mud at them, you can do anything you want to a Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, Posse Comitatus, homeschool, white survivalist, and get away with it.
Although the sedition law remains in existence, I doubt our government will have to use this law to indict and possibly convict political opponents in the future. Just as predicted in George Orwell's book, 1984, there are hundreds of political prisoners in our federal correctional institutes for thought crimes. That is, because they are looked upon by the government as dissidents, they can be convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison under the charges of conspiracy to commit RICO.
Sedition's awful hard to prove.
What angle were they going to try?
Well, RICO's their best thing. Conspiracy to commit RICO is easy. That's a thought crime. You don't need any proof or any evidence. There's many people in prison today that there was no evidence against, but the government says, well, this person said they were thinking about doing it or they were planning on doing it, so they're in prison serving 20 years for RICO for thought crimes. They don't need proof that these people said it, only somebody who is willing to say that they said it.
I understand that that the government is able to charge people through just conversation with RICO. Is that true?
Well, there's conspiracy to commit RICO. So you can talk about, not RICO itself, but you can talk with someone else about, let's say, robbing a bank, and you can still get 20 years for it. It doesn't even seem possible.
Thought crime.
That's what it is. It doesn't seem possible, does it? But it's true. I have 20 years for it. So do many of my other co-defendants.
You have 20 years for the thought crime.
Well, the conspiracy to commit.
The conspiracy to
commit RICO, racketeering, influence, corrupt organization, conspiracy to commit a crime. Talking about it. Prior to, not only was I convicted for the crime, I was convicted for thinking about and talking about the crime itself.
And with the introduction and possible near future implementation of the Genocide Treaty, many fear America's future for religious liberties seem bleak.
Well, I believe that now they're going on to a much bigger concept. They're going to drop sedition in its usual form, and they're going to use the Genocide Treaty and the laws implementing the Genocide Treaty to accomplish the same thing. Now, strangely enough, they really don't need to have implementation laws for the Genocide Treaty. They're already doing it. It sounds as though they are going against anyone that would have the idea or the concept of destroying the Jewish race of people. That is the rationale for the Genocide Treaty. They don't want another Holocaust to take place. All right, so consequently, the entire genocide concept is to prevent another, what has been termed a Holocaust. All right, so now in so doing, 50 years later, 50 years after the fact, they put John Demjanjuk on trial, and he proved unequivocally that he wasn't even Ivan the Terrible. And yet, when the Prime Minister came through and said that the whole purpose of this trial is to, something to the fact, the whole purpose of this trial is to see to it that the Holocaust never happens again. It was the signal that they're going to pass that, cause him to be guilty, which they did. And it's a death sentence placed against this man. Now, he is as innocent as the driven snow, and yet he will be put up as a martyr. And so here now was the concept genocide, and that he was brought out for punishment for what that was considered genocide against another peoples in World War II. And yet in reality, here was genocide itself being placed on against a single Christian individual.
My understanding is that genocide is if any person, group, makes any derogatory statement against another race or individual, that person can be taken to a country belonging to the UN and tried for genocide. Now, that means an American citizen who says something about a Jew, perhaps, could be taken to Israel and tried in their courts under their laws. I don't know the penalties for that, but just the fact that we can be taken from this country and tried in another country is something in itself. And also bear in mind that a treaty with the UN overrides the Constitution, so you have no constitutional rights when it comes to this.
Maybe they are not saying this. Maybe they are not selling this idea, but that the genocide treaty will be used for the destruction of the Christian faith. It's going to come down against Christians such as our forefathers at the time of the Revolution.
You can talk with someone else about, let's say, robbing a bank, and you can still get 20 years for it.
The government does not, and for a long time has not, worn a white hat.
It's the right of the people to speak. That's what's on trial here.
The government of the United States, the Congress and public officials are controlled by communists, international Jews, and plutocrats.
The government can afford to try you whether they have any evidence or not. They can ruin you financially.
Over 150 other political prisoners being held by the federal government.
What you had going on in Fort Smith, Arkansas, was simply one battle in this continual war between the gods, between the state and the King of Kings.
My ideas about the FBI changed pretty seriously.
I don't believe that we should have a de facto government.
We saw Zionism as the basic manifestation of a worldwide government.
Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Scandinavian, and kindred people are the Israel people of Scripture. There's simply been a case of mistaken identity, and it is not these people called Jews today.
I hate this government because it sets itself up in a position that's God's position.
It's an organic movement. You can't stop it. It doesn't have a clubhouse. It does not have dues. It's an idea, and you cannot kill an idea.
The government has decided that these guys are getting too outspoken, and it's time to shut them down and to destroy the movement.
My knee only bends to my God. It won't bend to these people.
Any government that goes to such low and underhanded methods is criminal in itself. To attack women and children, to threaten them.